Okay, so I think we all learned a lot in the previous three sharings, and I think they give us a lot of inspiring ideas about how we should sort of treat our rural areas, especially now we are going to have a big development there. So what I want to do today is actually first of all, talk about the origin of the Hong Kong planning standards and guidelines, because what I find is that this piece of document, planning standards and guidelines, they play a certain role in sort of like determining the form of the new development areas. And I will, come to that. Now, before I do that, I don't know whether, I think, if you're a Hong Konger, you must be familiarized with this map. So basically, the brown areas are the urban areas, Kowloon, Hong Kong Island. All the green areas are country parks. And then these pinkish orange areas are new towns. And then, this yellow area, yellowish area is our new territories. I don't know whether you know about the density differences among these three urban forms in a sense. So the main urban areas amount to about 36,000 persons per square kilometers, whereas the new towns is like half of that, like 20,000, whereas the rural areas is only 1,100. I don't know whether, is there a reason for that? I think if we really look into Hong Kong's colonial past, it might give us some ideas. So basically, the British colonial government, they ceded, the ceded territory basically is Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, right? And so at that time, they were pretty uncomfortable with this tiny dot of land, and then immediately is the mainland. And so they asked for a buffer zone. And that's why the new territories was given to, not given, but was leased to the British colonial government at that time. Now, so imagine that you were the colonizer in a sense. So the urban areas, not the current urban areas, basically is the ceded territory. And so most of the development actually, were there, basically. They tried to just develop, on Hong Kong Island and Kowloon. But what happened was that in the 1960s, there were urban riots. In 1966, it's because of the rise of the ferry fare in Star Ferry, and that started the riots. And the one in 1967 was more like a spillover of the Cultural Revolution from the mainland. And one of the reasons for these riots were very poor living conditions for many people, and the colonial government kind of like thought that it's very important to give people dignified, housing rights. And that's why the colonial government started to build the 10-year housing program. Now, given the fact that, if you look into Hong Kong, you can see that it's actually not much sort of land for this expansion. And that's why they have to sort of think about, reclaiming land to build new towns. Okay, so what they try to do, the first generation new towns like Sha Tin, you can see that basically is sort of reclaiming land along the coastal areas. They resumed land from the villages basically, and then reclaimed this land in Two Moon, Sha Tin, and Tai Po, etc. So you can see this. That's why most of our new towns are built along the coastal areas. Now, imagine that they have to build these new towns. Okay, so housing program, expansion of, they need land, so you got the new towns development. Now, this new towns development, because they are building several new towns more or less at the same time. So instead of going to different departments asking for, their spatial needs, so they try to consolidate, a set of planning standards and guidelines for for that development. So so these are the sort of like strategic, well, Hong Kong strategic plan is more like physical oriented. But anyway, so these are the strategic plans. You can see like in 1970, that's a colony outline plan. It was revised in 1974 into two parts. One is about the planning standards, which is related to today's Hong Kong planning standards and guidelines. The second part is the development strategy. And that's more or less the same time when they have to sort of like, plan and design the new towns. In 1981, there's the Planning Standards Subcommittee was formed under the most important committee for planning and development in the city. And in 1982, so the Hong Kong Outline Plan actually became the Hong Kong Planning Standards and Guidelines. And the part two, which, basically should be the development strategy, became the territorial development strategy. And then it became the territorial development strategy review. And then it became today's Hong Kong 2030 and now the Hong Kong 2030 plus. Now, according to the planning standards and guidelines, so understanding, that's the origin comes from this new towns development, and therefore you need planning standards and guidelines. It says, it will reserve adequate land to facilitate social and economic development and to provide appropriate public facilities to meet the needs of the public. So it's basically trying to say that they would like to have an equitable basis for allocation of the scarce land resources. So basically, the planning standards and guidelines, is used to produce a land use budgets for these new areas. Now, when we look at this, we understand that these new areas, the reclaimed land maybe is as new area is flat. This kind of approach may work, even though that's the case. Later on, we'll see that it's actually not, it's not as simple as that. But anyway, so that's how the planning standards and guidelines are developed. So the Hong Kong Planning Standards and Guidelines has 12 chapters, and this planning, standards and guidelines are very important according to the government. As you can see in this hierarchy, it's very useful for the territorial development strategy, for the statutory plans, and also for the local plans. So you can see that it covers many aspects. So different aspects are taken care of by different bureaus and departments. So it's not a set of planning standards and guidelines, just produced by the planning department. It's more like, okay, the planning department, remember when they first built the new towns, so they need to go to different bureaus and different departments asking for sort of like, planning standards, whether it's about residential density, whether it's about community facilities, open spaces, or, more like related to the economic or transport or environmental or even conservation, urban design, aspects. However, so as I've said, although the new town seems to be just built on reclaimed land, actually they were next to many villages. I don't know whether you know about Hong Kong actually has 27 rural communities. And in fact, Sha Tin, where I'm now in the university, you can see that even Sha Tin, you might not know that Sha Tin actually has the second largest number of villages in Hong Kong. Or Chuan Kwan O has villages as well. And also, of course, Tuen Mun and other parts. So because of this, the implications of having this planning standards and guidelines for building sort of like reclaimed land, flat land, new towns, but then, without paying attention to the context, produce, interesting implications. So these are all Google images. As you can see that you have all these rural kind of landscape, but, suddenly you will have this, huge development, mega development right next to the original, villages in all the new towns. So if we talk about this no transitional zone, no integration, there's no real phrase that our city has gone through to figure out how we should do transitional planning, rural-urban linkages. And also because of the planning standards and guidelines, in a sense, we kind of like produce pretty standardized design and building footprints. Why? Because if we look into, the planning standards and guidelines, which sort of like tells us like, the domestic plot ratios, like how high you can build. If you don't know the meaning of plot ratio, basically, say if it says R18, meaning like if you have a piece of land, what you can do is like in terms of residential land uses, you can build 8 times, that amount of land, which is quite huge. So if you cover half of the land, then you can build up to 16-story, so on and so forth. Now, the question related to what we want to discuss today is it's about, not just about the main urban areas, it's about this new development area, or what they call comprehensive development area in terms of redevelopment as well. They will have an automatic plot ratio of 6.5. Yes, it's lower than the other, that you can find in Hong Kong Island or Kowloon or Tsuen Wan as well. But then it's still pretty high. If we are talking about like, planning needs to pay attention to the context, that is something that we may not be able to do if we follow, this standards and guidelines. Now, another aspect is that our planning standards and guidelines are rather number driven. It's pretty quantitative in nature. Like, either we have like a set standard, for instance, 5.5 beds per 1,000 persons, or like if you reach certain population threshold, then you're entitled to certain facilities. Now, this may be okay for the new towns because they build mostly on flat reclaimed land. There's very little in set sort of like context. But the problem, of course, also is that these standards and guidelines, they were first set in the 70s. There's no regular review. Very often the review has to do with the initiation of policies or policy changes. It's also done within the government with very little involvement of the general public. So, and as I've said, there's very little about like rural-urban linkages in the document itself. The context, the planning standards and guidelines do not really sort of like pay too much attention on the context. And if we sort of today talk about the Lantau tomorrow and Northern Metropolis, well, the question is like, are they really new development areas as such? To home this is new development areas. So anyway, so let's move on to really look into this two projects and ask some more questions. So that's Northern Metropolis has a conceptual boundary. But basically, it should cover the northern and the Yunnan districts. And then Lantau tomorrow, actually, this is the first part with 1,000 hectares, and then they would have another 700 hectares. So they have this, artificial islands. So the idea of Lantau tomorrow is basically using Lantau as what they call a double gateway, the international and the Greater Bay Area. Gateway to the international world, and then, to the Greater Bay Area through infrastructure development. It's supposed to be a livable city, an economic powerhouse, which is sustainable and with conservation, and also a place for leisure and entertainment. And for the Khao Yi Chau artificial islands, there are 3 planning objectives, prosperous and diverse, green and livable, forward-looking and innovative. But of course, there are questions that we can ask, like, okay, so artificial islands reclamation seems to be, not very in terms of conservation. A lot of people have raised questions. So the artificial islands emphasize a lot on the 15-minute neighborhoods, but actually in the planning standards and guidelines, there are no such discussions. So 15-minute neighborhoods, is a very hot and fashionable planning idea in many parts of the world today. It should not just be the privilege of the artificial island, should it be implemented throughout our city? If that's the case, then how should the planning standards and guidelines be revisited? Now, if you've not been to sort of the artificial island area. So this is a photo that I think I took a couple of years ago, and this gives you some ideas about like the stretch of water where you can see the Hong Kong Island in the horizon, and you can use your planning imagination to imagine, like, what will this seascape, be transformed into with all this development. Here, this is looking out from the beach in Peng Chau. And again, you can imagine that in the future, it would not be like this little, inlet where you can see the Hong Kong Island landscape, but it will be like, this mega buildings in front of you. Peng Chau's land area is about, it's less than, almost like 1 square kilometers. Its population is less than 7,000. So that means it's about 7,000 per square kilometer in terms of population density. But the artificial island's density would be like more than 7 times of it. So I mean, when I talk about, mention about context, I think it's this kind of like context that we're talking about. Is it desirable, Anyway, so if we look at the planning parameters, as I've said, this 1,000 hectares will accommodate about 500,000 or a little bit more of the population. So these are the residential units and public-private housing ratio. So we can actually see that 6.5. So because it's new development area, so it automatically get a 6.5, and for the CBD is 7.5 as well. So, but if we look into the Hong Kong Planning Standards and Guidelines, if you remember Chapter 2, it's actually just about the residential density. In the whole Planning Standards and Guidelines, there's nothing about housing standards, basically. We also understand that they will also have a higher per person open space standard. And the Planning Standards and Guidelines is 2 meters square per person, but then in these artificial islands is 3.5. So should this be all upgraded throughout Hong Kong? That's another question. And just now, Professor Mike Douglas mentioned about neighborhoods as an employment generator. But in the Planning Standards and Guidelines, there's no standard on job creation in general. So these are some of the things that, we sort of, can consider about, when we use this document for a new area. But then we may not have, the tools to do it. But then, here, this amount of job employment, this employment opportunities, so it's just so high in a sense, because we understand that a lot of people actually move, have to come from all the new towns back to the city areas for work. Even for the whole of Hong Kong Island, the employment opportunities are not more than 800,000. And that is for the whole Hong Kong Island. And here, it will be like a very sizable amount of jobs that can be created. So if we are doing it for these artificial islands, can we do similar things in other parts of the city as well? And how can we ensure, these can be delivered? Anyway, so if we look into the Hong Kong Planning Standards and Guidelines, reclamation, when you search for reclamation, it's related to science park, industrial estate development, or very often reclamation is identified as a source of pollution and may affect water flow, etc. So I mentioned about, this question about like, given the context and this plot ratio of 6.5, which actually would give rise to, it's actually the density will be even higher than the Hong Kong Island. No context, that's the same for the Northern Metropolis that we're going to talk about real soon. And also there's no place-based knowledge that we can actually understand more about. And also, like Professor Douglas talked about these mega trends, especially about the global climate change. Climate change is mentioned once in the Hong Kong Planning Standards and Guidelines, and its relation is in relation to the district cooling system. Of course, there's no discussion of sea level rise or storm surge as well. So these are some of the questions that we have to ask. Of course, we understand that the Hong Kong Planning Standards and Guidelines is not the only planning tool for us to do planning in Hong Kong. Not for just for the urban area or new towns or new development areas. There are many other policies and many other rules and regulations as well. But since it's called Planning Standards and Guidelines, we need to really take it seriously, especially when it's providing inputs for planning at different levels. All right, so the Northern Metropolis, I think if you were here earlier on, Professor Douglas' slides also show that, this part of Hong Kong is actually very low lying and is prone to sea level rise, to flooding as well. So this is the conceptual boundary of the Northern Metropolis development strategy. If you're still not sure about what's inside, basically, it includes all the existing new towns, all the yellow patches, and then, of course, the Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Innovation and Technology Park. And then the green ones are the developing, new development areas, all this green one. And so the purple one are the new ones. So the new territories, North, New Town, the Mee Kam Development Corridor, and then, currently the Sentient Technopole, which has caused a lot of discussions. I think Susanna also mentioned about that earlier on. Now, what I want to say is that, again, context is so important. It's not a piece of land that has no history, no context, no culture, no ecology. It actually, if we look into the North District and also the Yunnan District, there are a total of 272 villages, which make up 42% of all the villages in Hong Kong. It's a very, interesting areas with a lot of history, a lot of ecology, a lot of culture. Now, if we look into the Northern Metropolis objectives and principles, there are 4 strategic objectives. And then 6 planning principles. So you can see I color-coded them. So basically, out of all these 10 important directions, 3 are more related to what I want to talk about, because the others are more about like how to integrate into China's overall development through enhancing the one country, 2 systems, integrating Hong Kong and Shenzhen, making this area the second economic engine for Hong Kong, for economic land provision, for boosting development capacity, and also to sort of improve this cross-boundary travel comfort. The 3 things, one is about urban-rural integration, which is something that the earlier talks focus on, and then proactive conservation, as well as providing high-quality eco-recreation and tourism outlets. Now, earlier on, Susanna talked about the Sentient Technopole. If you remember, she also included this lines. I think she has 3 lines. One is the Maipole, sort of like the Ramsar sites, the Maipole wetland Ramsar sites. And then, this light blue areas is actually the wetland conservation, areas. And then this is produced by the Town Planning Board. And then the dark blue areas is actually the wetland buffer areas, the buffer zone. So you can see, so this is the Hong Kong, Shenzhen. I hope you can see my, let me see. Okay, so this is Hong Kong, Shenzhen Innovation and Technology Park. And so this is the Sentient Technopole, this whole area. And you can see this technology zone actually eats into the conservation belts. And of course, the whole plan actually, eats into all this buffer area. So this is another way of trying to see how how sort of like the plan encroach into the conservation areas and also the buffer area. I actually got this slide from Ms. Katie Chick, slide from a workshop organized by the Hong Kong Institute of Architects. So she sort of like, talk about the importance of having this. If we are talking about rural urban integration, that's also one of the key principle, right, by this development strategy. But if you look into this, you can see that the sort of like the villages will remain there, and then you will have all these urban developments, encroaching into this various aspects. And she raised this question about fragmentation and this, it seems like there's urbanization, but is it really having rural urban integration? That's a question that she has raised. Okay, so maybe so what I sort of want to conclude before we can have some further discussion for the whole group is that I think maybe HKPSG would be okay if you are just planning for a piece of flat land without history and context. But unfortunately, I think such land usually does not really exist. Definitely not in a city, like Hong Kong, because even our new towns they have a lot of villages in its vicinity. It's just like in those days when we would like to fulfill the 10-year housing program, and we had this, spur of development that we kind of like lost the opportunity of building new towns that would sort of have very different characteristics due to sort of like the existing heritage. So following these standards and guidelines very often make us produce new towns which look more or less the same. And I think another question is about this mechanical density calculations to plan our city. I think it does not really work, because we all understand that, I think from Professor Yang, Professor Douglas, and also Susanna's presentation, we need to plan with nature in context, with place-based knowledge. And actually, I think we should have very different planning vision, standards and guidelines for urban areas, for rural areas, or the peri-urban areas. So I think in a sense, the Northern Metropolis, or even like, the artificial islands, we can't just say that they are new development areas and automatically grant them 6.5 plot ratio as if, they are new development areas without paying attention to, its integration, into its context. Even in China, when they do planning, what they do is like they will identify no-go areas, and then they will identify areas that would have very sensitive development, like, that you don't harm the carrying capacity of the environment. And then you can have moderate development, and then you can have areas where you have, high density, high development intensity. So I think that's what we should sort of move forward towards. And I really feel like we should have a proper chapter on residential planning and not residential density only. And also in Hong Kong, although Sentient Technopole is actually something quite innovative in Hong Kong, because we're really planning for the growth of the innovation and technology industry. But in order to do that, we can't just produce a plan. It has to be a holistic, comprehensive set of policies to sort of like nurture an economic structure. And you can only do that, when you really have a lot of knowledge about that industry, whether it's primary industry like fishing, agriculture, or high-tech industry like, smart city technologies, or AI, or data mining, or this, cloud infrastructure, etc. So you do need a lot of knowledge which goes beyond the provision of a piece of land in order to nurture that. And also, I think in Hong Kong, although we do have like the town planning board has this practice guide to protect the fish ponds, but it seems like our conservation policies and practices are rather tokenistic. So I mean, personally, of course, I have a lot of doubts about the wisdom of doing reclamation, you know, in the central water areas, given climate crisis and sea level rise. And even for Northern Metropolis, I understand that if we do need to, I mean, if we really want to want Hong Kong to move forward, we may need to really, you know, think about a more strategic way of using our land resources, especially in the new territories. That's a direction which I would support. But then the question is that we do need sort of like a more holistic, a more comprehensive and strategic planning. That we do need, if you remember, Professor Yang mentioned, we need place-based research, evidence-based planning parameters. We do need a more participatory, sort of like transparent, you know, planning and design processes for planet, place, and people-friendly development. So, you know, you can refer back to what Professor Yang has mentioned in her work. So I think is that sort of like what I want to share today, sort of looking at the origin of the Hong Kong planning standards and guidelines, understanding the problem is like, it's really for, sorry, I didn't turn on my video, but anyway, so it's more for land use planning for the new towns back in the 70s, and the question about so if we use this for these two strategic sites, is it the most appropriate, you know, approach?